Hello and welcome to Full Contact Nerd. I'm Cris Alvarez and thank you for listening. I'm speaking with Simon Stephenson, author of Set My Heart to 5, published by Hanover Square Press, September 1st, 2020. Thank you for speaking with me.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to chat to you.
Cool. So first, I'm sure you have a lot of ideas running around in your head. How did this particular one rise above the rest and get written and published?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because I think we do all have that sort of, endless roster of things that we think maybe I'll write this or maybe I'll write that. And I've been trying to write a novel for a very long time. I published about 9 years before this one, which gives you a bit of an idea of how long I've been trying.
Oh.
With this one, it was one of the few times, it so rarely happens for me, but this one was, I can genuinely say that when the idea arrived, it kind of arrived sort of fully formed, and I kind of knew, I at least knew the character in the book, Jared, is a screenwriting android, ultimately. And the idea that, came to me was the screenwriting android. I think where that came from was two things. One was that I had been living in the Bay Area. I'd moved to the Bay Area kind of 18 months before, and it's very sort of near future type place in some ways, because of course it's, an ordinary city the same as any other, but so many of the people that you meet and encounter are, people that are working in tech in some form or other, or some startup, and some of the ideas that you hear people talk about, even just things that they're working on, would sometimes take me aback in terms of how futuristic they seemed. And I remember the first time, they're not in the Bay Area, but the first time I met someone from SpaceX who was, I hadn't really heard of him, and it was like a friend of a friend, and I asked him, he was explaining what he did, and I said, "Oh, that's great. I hope you guys managed to launch a rocket sometime." And he said, "Oh, we've been launching a rocket every week for the past 2 years." And so that sort of sense of, wow, the future's already here. There was also an incident when I stayed in a hotel, and I forgot my toothpaste, and I called down for to see if someone would bring up some toothpaste, and what they sent up was basically a little robot with the toothpaste. So that was part of it. And then the other part of it, the screenwriting part, my day job at that time, I was working for an animation company who are well known for kind of essentially the emotion in the movies that they make. And so a lot of my day job was spent kind of thinking about that, and how movies engender emotion, and the ways they succeed and the ways they fail. And so I think kind of putting those things together, brought me to a android who is trying to be a screenwriter.
So let's talk about the book itself. Can you tell me a little about the protagonist, the setting, the conflict?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, so the book is set in 2054, and one of the reviews described it as an all-too-human 2054, which I think is quite a good way of putting it. So it's not a dystopia. It's not, things haven't gone terribly wrong. They've just gone a bit wrong, and kind of in a sort of human way. So two of the details about the world. One is that humans have now locked themselves out of the internet, and we did that by when you forget the name of you forget your password, and then it sends it to your old email account for recovery, but you've forgotten the password for your old email account, so it asks you the name of your first pet and your favorite teacher. And so we're saying that on a critical day in 2037, enough humans forgot the name of their first pet and favorite teacher, and that kind of led to this panicked wave of forgetting, which locks humans out of the internet, which of course has terrible consequences these days. And then the other sort of slightly more comical fact is that it's a world where Elon Musk has incinerated the moon. And it's important to say that he did this in a hilarious prank. He wasn't trying to do anything wrong. It was kind of, like when he sent the Tesla Roadster into space. It was just that sort of prank, but he didn't realize people weren't going to like it. So that is that kind of 2054. I've been calling it a mistopia, like MISS-topia for the near miss rather than dystopia. And then the book is written by Jared, who's an android. And so one of the things about 2054 is we will have, at least in this world, we will have androids by then. I think we may well actually. Jared's sort of makeup is that he's essentially a physical human body. So he's manufactured from human DNA, and the only difference is that they've taken out the bit of in the source code of his DNA. They've swapped out the bit of DNA that codes for consciousness with DNA, which essentially codes for, say, Windows 97. And so that gives you a programmable android. But as humans, we're of course going to be very, we're naturally suspicious, and we're protective of the things that we feel are ours. So we're going to make the androids do all the jobs we don't want to do. So Jared's a dentist to that end. But one of the sort of main things that humans are going to be concerned about is really the only advantage we're going to have over artificial intelligence is emotion and feelings, because, of course, they can do everything calculation and language kind of based far better than us. So the idea then is that humans are, don't let bots have any feelings, and Jared, of course, slowly begins to wonder if he might be feeling something. So the movie is kind of the story of Jared's emotional awakening, an emotional awakening which occurs, it's kind of provoked by seeing old movies. The idea is that in the future all the movies are, big Marvel kind of extravaganzas about killer robots, but there's still, the small sort of repertory theatres still show kind of old-fashioned movies. But of course by 2054, we've all locked ourselves out of the internet, which led to this great, a great crash, a kind of great data loss event. And that means that, most of the movies from, the last 50 years before that were lost. And, the movies that survived were the movies that were stored on film because they weren't stored digitally. And of course, the movies that survived because they were stored on film were, mainly the movies that they had a lot of prints of. So that would be, the big commercial hits. So kind of one of the jokes in the book is that if you're a cinephile today, you love to go to, the cinema and see an obscure French documentary from 1964 that's 8 hours long and in black and white. But if you're a cinephile in 2054, you're going to go and see things like Titanic. But you're still going to come back and tell all your friends that you've seen this wonderful obscure art film that, they won't appreciate because it's high art. And you're the cinephile and they're not. So yeah, Jared sort of, learns his emotions from a very particular kind of movie, which is things like, say, The Shawshank Redemption, movies which, have had a big impact on me. And all that being so, eventually he, the Bureau of Robotics, who are the organization that are charged with sort of overseeing robots and making sure they don't feel, eventually learn that Jared has been going to the movies. And that's obviously a problem. Bots aren't allowed to go to the movies. So, they sent him a notice to come in and be wiped or incinerated. And as a sort of farewell gesture, Jared has one human friend who's the person that kind of introduced him to the movies. And the friend shows him sort of one last movie. And for better or for worse, the movie that the friend shows Jared is Blade Runner. And obviously, if you're an android, that's going to, I think as humans we love that movie, but if you're an android, that's, going to be a very profound experience in terms of, representation and seeing yourself on the screen. So Blade Runner has this huge effect on Jared. He thinks it's the greatest movie that's ever made, and he thinks that it's so moving when, Harrison Ford and Rutger Hauer wrestling on the rooftop, and the dying android makes his very famous speech. Jared is so moved by that he gets the idea that, look, if only humans could see this movie, then they wouldn't want to. How could you see this movie and then want to incinerate an android for having feelings? If they saw this movie, they would understand. And of course, Jared's friend said, well, the problem here is humans have all seen this movie. This movie was really popular. Everyone's seen it already. Jared, the android, is sort of baffled because he still thinks, well, how can they want to incinerate me then? And the doctor says, well, the problem is, this movie was made before we had androids. So believe it or not, humans watch this movie about a feeling android, and they don't think, oh, wow, androids are more sensitive and kinder than we thought. They think, wow, the humans that made this film are more sensitive and kind than we ever thought, because they can even make an android seem sensitive. So, of course, Jared being an android, he has a very sort of logical thought process, and it's, in many ways too logical, because he sort of deciphers this to mean, wait, are you saying that if I if I, as an android, went and wrote a movie about feeling androids, then people would accept that as proof that androids can feel. And the doctor says, no, his friend who's the doctor says, no, that's not what I was saying at all. But of course, Jared gets the idea in his head, and so, Jared then basically, the emotional thrust of the book is that Jared sets out to write his own movie that's going to change the world, because it's going to stop humans thinking that robots like him should be incinerated if they have feelings. And then, of course, so he sets out to Los Angeles for this great adventure, and having been someone myself who set out for Los Angeles for a great adventure in screenwriting, things rarely go to plan on that mission.
I'm speaking with Simon Stephenson, author of Set My Heart to 5. You can find more information about his work at simonstephenson.com. If you like this podcast, Full Contact Nerd, so far, please subscribe to it and rate it if you can. Please sign up for my weekly newsletter at fullcontactnerd.com or crisalvarez.com to keep up with my latest posts. You'll also find written interviews and my social media links there. You can find the links to my other podcasts at militaryhistorypodcast.com and technologyandspace.com. Now back to the podcast. So, I've read the first chapter of the book, and at first I was a little, so the writing, the way it's broken out was a little bit different. So it threw me for a little bit, but I've gotten into the rhythm of it, and it's interesting, especially when you add the bit about what his journey will be.
Thank you. Yeah, the Android voice is, it's definitely a tricky thing to get right, and I think some people love it. I think some people find it a little bit of a challenge, and in truth, that's kind of what I was trying to do, because I sort of I think androids, if they try to write a book, it will be different from the books that we're accustomed to, and kind of the idea. I mean, Jared sort of he says it in the book that he kind of, one of the things he finds hardest as a writer is simply paragraphs, because androids are programmed to think in code. They think in code, so sort of lots of hard returns and just individual lines, which, as the book progresses and Jared kind of gets more practice at writing, it kind of slightly evolves into a sort of more conventional layout or format of the book.
Mm-hmm. Part of he kind of reminded me, or the character reminds me of Data from Star Trek. Not precisely, but in a sense, sort of that probing, searching, confused manner.
Absolutely, yeah. I think there's a sort of a great history of kind of androids, going all the way back to let's say even Frankenstein's monster, being sort of mystified by humans and kind of wanting to understand us and be like us and not always get it right. So yeah, Data was definitely one of the inspirations, and he's a very good model for like a very sort of human looking android, isn't he?
Mm-hmm. So did you do any research for the book?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that like most of this, like I'm endlessly inspired by geography and place, and geography and place are really important to me. So a lot of the basically 3 geographic locations in the book, so sort of which maybe I won't say to spoil surprises, but a lot of it, kind of the detail of the book actually comes from my own journey and my own experiences here in Los Angeles and California, and the film business. So a lot of that I didn't really have to research, because it's the book is set in kind of a recognizable 2054. So it's it's the same streets and the same places, but we now have androids walking them. And then in terms of the in terms of the AI and the data, and just in terms of the AI and the biological issues. So I am. By trade, I was a physician. I was a doctor in the UK, and so the sort of I think the basic the basic idea, a lot of that comes from, I'm endlessly fascinated by this technology called CRISPR, which I'm sure you and your listeners are familiar with, which is, the technology by which humans can now essentially edit the human genome. And I just feel I'm so excited by this technology. I think it has this amazing capacity to, provide treatments for things which, long haven't had any treatments. But I also feel that as a society, the discussions that we're having just aren't really aware of where the technology is. So for instance, I'm from Edinburgh in Scotland, and one of our famous inhabitants, ex-inhabitant, was Dolly the sheep, who, if you remember, Dolly the sheep was the sheep that was cloned in 1997. Which is now 23 years ago. And if you think so, 23 years ago we were cloning sheep. We're now at a point where, a few years ago I read in the paper that Barbara Streisand had cloned her pet dog after it died, and it had cost her $30,000. So, I think the notion of, my understanding is that, the technology to clone a human is, probably absolutely already there. And hopefully no one's doing it, but, I would not be surprised if in some dark warehouse in some corner of the world, some sinister experiment is already afoot. So I think in terms of, that's kind of where the idea of an android that's created by manipulating DNA came from, is probably my own sort of medical background and interest. And then, but yeah, in terms of AI itself, I would have to confess that that's not sort of so heavily researched or accurate in the way that some science fiction can be and often is. And I think really what in terms of the hierarchy of things that I was wanting to write about, I was sort of more concerned with exploring emotion and what a non-human might think of us, rather than getting the kind of, the precise details of how an AI would function on a theoretical cognitive level, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I guess I think there's the term social science fiction. It sounds like it falls in that category. I hadn't heard that term. That sounds exactly great. I mean, people have said that speculative fiction can be more ideas based and science fiction is supposed to be more accurate. I don't know if that's right, but that was another term I heard. But I do like social science fiction. Maybe I'll start saying that. Yeah. I think I've come across it, like Fahrenheit 451 and things like that.
Yeah, no, that sounds ideal. I think that's a great term. I think I'm going to be updating my website when we get off the call.
What are some of the things, books, music, or shows that generally inspire you or your creativity?
Right, great question. I mean, I think in some ways, this book is itself kind of it's kind of a love letter to the movies. So it's really hugely inspired by film in general, and perhaps specifically by the kind of movies that I grew up seeing, because I was born in 1978 and I grew up in Scotland. So, let's say I was 15 in 1993, and I think we probably all have, some of our most formative experiences in those teenage years. 1993 in movies was things like Forrest Gump and The Shawshank Redemption. So, these were studio movies, right? So they certainly, were commercial products. But yet they always had, to my viewing, they had these, massive amounts of heart. And sure, they didn't get everything right. And with hindsight, some of them can be problematic. But I think partly what I was trying to capture in the book was the experience that I used to have of seeing those movies, which was, I always felt like I was taken on this kind of emotional roller coaster, that you plug in at the start of the movie and you knew that you were going to, be taken on this, rapid journey where you were going to laugh and cry and be horrified, and and then ultimately at the end you would feel this cathartic sense of relief and release, and this feeling that you had been on this exhilarating journey, and it had been a great journey, and it had concluded in the right way, and that feeling is kind of, I think, in lots of ways what I've spent my time as a screenwriter trying to capture, but particularly with this book that was supposed to be kind of a love letter to the movies. I set myself the really bold and ambitious task of trying to kind of emulate that feeling, so trying to give the reader that sort of same experience of highs and lows, and when you complete the journey, emotional catharsis. So I would say that those movies have really probably been the biggest influence on this book. And then in terms of the writing itself, I think a couple of writers, for instance, so Cory Doctorow's Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom. I probably read that again at a fairly... no, I mean, I was older, wasn't I, because it came out in the early 2000s. But certainly that was, a critical book, just in terms of the way he writes about, big ideas with humour. So that was one. Also in writing about ideas, I mean, Douglas Copeland, the Canadian writer, he wrote Generation X and Girlfriend in a Coma and things like that. And again, not a sci-fi writer per se, but just kind of like a writer of ideas. And in some ways, this was it was really exciting to me to write a book where I was able to explore some ideas and some thoughts I have about the strange ways in which we behave as humans. That if an alien came and saw us, they would say, well, why are you doing that? Why is that the situation?
Yeah. Does the book have any sort of, what do you think the soundtrack of the book would be? Like, what's its aesthetic? What's its feel?
Oh, brilliant! Well, that's a really good question, and I've never been asked that before. I think it would be, the world in which the book is set is this weird sort of hybrid near future. So it's 2054, and so we have androids, but equally then we have. So we've gone rapidly forward in some ways, but we've gone fairly far back in others, in that, for instance, we don't have airplanes anymore, because when they had the great data loss event, the great crash, all the airplanes fell out of the sky. And, so of course the technology still exists, but the problem is that all the airlines and the insurance companies and whoever else are all just locked in this this death spiral of litigation stemming from that terrible event. So I think the music would probably reflect that like it might be something that's both from the past and from the future. So for instance, one of the bits of music that Jared sort of is drawn to is he's a dentist, and his receptionist and his dental hygienist love the that pina colada song about if you like pina coladas. And so that's kind of always playing on an oldie station, and Jared's kind of just obsessed with that song and the weird things that go on, and that even to us humans are intriguing and interesting, but to Jared are just baffling. So I think there'd be the oldies, but then also, like, for instance, I'm Scottish, and so we have a band, Churches, who of course are they're global stars at this point, but they make this sort of like slightly futuristic sort of synth pop, but it goes it draws on things like Blondie, and I think maybe something like that. That's a mixture of the past and the future.
Sounds like the 80s. Which felt like a mixture.
Absolutely. That sounds about right to me.
Yeah. Would you say there's anything out of the ordinary that you do to complete your work?
Like on a sort of practical, pragmatic writing level?
Yes.
A good question. I think I've been a full-time writer for 8 or 9 years now on the screenwriting side, and before that I'd written a book and I'd always written, and I think unfortunately no, I think that all that I've learned is it's just about showing up at your desk every day. And I wish I had some magic, some magic method or protocol or hack. But even on the bad days, I think I've learned that what comes out is just directly proportional to the hours to the hours put in. So for me, it's it is all that advice that you always read about, just routine and trying to write. I don't have a set word count every day, but I certainly set myself goals and things like that. And I think just coffee and time on the chair, unfortunately, is my only secret.
Yeah. Are you one who likes to listen to music while you write, or you avoid that?
Yeah, it has to be very specific, so I do like it, but I sort of like acoustic music with few lyrics tends to be my jam when I'm writing, because if I'm listening to something that has a lot of lyrics, I'll find those lyrics mystically appearing on the page that I'm writing. Is always a problem. I've worked out over the years that my best thing is I'm not someone who loves complete isolation, but equally too much noise makes it very difficult for me to write. So it turns out that technology is actually my friend here, because the invention of the noise cancelling headphones has just been an absolute game changer. So whereas my friends used to always say, oh, you can write anywhere, why don't you write in the coffee shop? And I would always think, well, that sounds great, but you go there and then someone next to you starts taking a phone call and someone else is doing an MLM scheme, and there's just too much going on. But what I've learned is that the noise cancelling technology, it doesn't silence that, but it just takes it down to this perfect background level. So I think I find that slight buzz of other humans being around, good and comforting, and a good place to write. And then the other thing about writing in a coffee shop here in Los Angeles is that you can see from a distance if someone's working on a screenplay, right? Because the way it's laid out on the page is so striking, and there's this tremendous evolutionary pressure which comes from sitting in a coffee shop and looking around you and seeing 10 other people are writing screenplays, and that they're all making frantic progress, or they're all typing very fast, and it's a really good incentive to think, well, she's doing very well. I'll better try and get some pages down, or I'm going to get left behind.
So, since you've been at this for 8 or 9 years, how has your approach to writing changed over that time, or has it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one thing that's probably good in terms of, because for most of that time it's been screenwriting, right? That's been my job, and I think the one thing that screenwriting is good at is it certainly stops you being precious, because you don't survive very long if you're precious about, if you're too precious about your work. And I think it it engenders this sense that it is a process. So all your, if you get the job to write a script for a studio or something, your contract by definition will have 3 steps in it or 4 steps in it, which is essentially 3 or 4 drafts. So the assumption is that the first draft is never going to be perfect. And I actually found that quite liberating, because I think as writers sometimes we have this idea that we're supposed to be these, untouchable geniuses that, deliver these, completed manuscripts that are word perfect, and nobody can have any thoughts on or change a word in. And obviously in screenwriting that can go too far. Obviously in screenwriting you sometimes get the, well, I love it, but what if we made the bad guy the good guy? And, all those kind of notes. But I think just that understanding of that it is a process, and that other voices can add something, I think has been something that I've learned. But then the flip side to that is I love William Goldman. He wrote The Princess Bride and a bunch of great movies, and he also wrote this incredible memoir about his life as a screenwriter, which was called Adventures in the Screen Trade, and it begins with the immortal line, "Nobody knows anything." Which is, I think, absolutely true, particularly when it comes to people's work. So I think one thing that I've learned is to certainly listen to feedback, but at the same time, if there's something that I'm certain about, and I'm sure that this is a great idea, and it's just I've not executed it well enough yet, or I've just, it needs to be polished, or it needs to, I think, I guess it's always a balance, is that I've learned, I think I've genuinely learned both to listen, but also, when not to listen.
Mm-hmm. I'm speaking with Simon Stephenson, author of Set My Heart to 5. You can find more information about his work at simonstephenson.com. If you like this podcast, Full Contact Nerd, so far, please subscribe to it and rate it if you can. Please sign up for my weekly newsletter at fullcontactnerd.com or crisalvarez.com to keep up with my latest posts. You'll also find written interviews and my social media links there. You can find the links to my other podcasts at militaryhistorypodcast.com and technologyandspace.com. Now back to the podcast. So what non-writing work have you done that may have influenced how or what you write? And you mentioned, your medical work, other stuff.
Yeah. It's a great question. I mean, I think it all goes into, I think all life experience kind of goes into this melting pot of, your mind, and when you're trying to tell stories, you tend to pick sort of elements out of it. So, and certainly I can see that in this book. So, Jared's a dentist and I was a doctor, and so there's obviously there's a bit of overlap there, and maybe some of Jared's frustrations that he ultimately begins to feel with dentistry once he starts to feel those are similar frustrations to maybe some of the ones that I had about medicine. And then, but for instance, so when I was as I say, I'm from Scotland, when I was in my early 20s, I came to the United States for the first time, and I spent a summer as a dishwasher in a restaurant on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. And in the book, Jared at one point gets a job as a dishwasher in a restaurant, and kind of all of that is, pretty much directly drawn from my experience of working in that restaurant kitchen. And I, that's great because, it was at this point 20 years ago, and I suppose I'd never really, thought about writing it, and I certainly at the time it wasn't research for anything, but I think that's a sort of great example of how the lived experience is just always so fantastically useful, and even if you don't write about it at the time, maybe you're going to write about it 20 years later.
Mm-hmm. So I know your bio mentions that you've worked for a major company. You didn't name it, so I'm not going to name it. So I'm just curious if you'd like to talk about that work or not.
Yeah, absolutely, sure. So, I think in fairness, I think I'm not supposed to mention it. However, in fairness, it is actually it's on. I noticed it is actually on the cover of the hardback book. So there's probably no harm. The company I work for was Pixar. I can't say much about it because the project I worked on, hasn't entered the world yet, and they're very, rightly sort of very protective. And I think it goes back to, the company was set up by Steve Jobs, and so you actually, in the same way that Apple are sort of very, you never know when the new iPhone's coming out until the announcement, right? And Pixar take a kind of similar approach. I guess what I can say is that it's one of the dream jobs in screenwriting. I'm their huge fan, and walking through those gates even was a thrill every day, and that's before you get the chance to work with them. And certainly, I think there's no secret that their process is one of iteration. They always say that the reason why they make good films is because along the way they've kind of explored every avenue and made every bad version of that film to get to the perfect one. And I think that was a really good lesson for me. Again, just going back to the fact, well, if these guys feel that way, then I should feel that way too. And I think it was just great in terms of like taking creative risk. And perhaps if I don't know, like if I had not worked there, I don't know if I would have placed this bet on myself to write a 450-page novel about a screenwriting android, because on the face of it, it seems like quite an odd and slightly out there idea. And I think maybe it was being around those people who, have that attitude of exploration and discovery that maybe gave me the confidence to do that.
Mm-hmm. So, and let me know if you can't answer this question, but writing for animated movies, for Pixar, is it a different process than your standard live action studio film?
Yeah. I mean, and again, like I think this, the stuff I'll talk about is all in the public domain, so I think that's fine. Yes, I mean, I think the Pixar movies are all, they use the phrase director-driven. Mm-hmm. So how that works is the directors at Pixar all kind of come from a sort of storyboard artist background. They're all, that's their training. And the movies are really all, they all belong to their director, perhaps more than anywhere else. The movie is, the director's child and labor of love. And rightly so, because they're the person that works on it for 5 years. And they're the person that steers the ship. And so as a writer there, you're kind of, you're brought on to, a director will have, pitched an idea for a story. And importantly, the idea has to have a real emotional resonance to the director. Usually I think it's based on some emotional experience that they've had at some point. And then once they have the idea, then they start meeting writers and they bring on a writer to work to the director's vision. And that's probably, I mean, here in Los Angeles, yes, the director is still the, is the great creative genius behind it. But, sometimes the director, I guess here often a director will come onto a project later. So, a studio will have optioned a book or will have an idea or you'll have an idea. And, often you'll, deliver the script. And then once they have the script, they'll go and find the director. So I think the Pixar model, probably fair to say it's a lot more organic. And, again, like I feel like perhaps that's part of the secret of why it's so emotional, that the stories are told, primarily from a point of people having a burning desire of a story they want to tell, rather than here in Los Angeles, which is usually, people spotting a gap in the market and realizing that there's a, that they don't have a spy film for next year, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I guess I'm fascinated because normally isn't the writer just, the script is bought and then the writer is basically told to just get out of here while we make the movie? And
yeah, I mean, I think that depends if you're, it kind of depends where you are in the firmament, right? And who you're working with. Some, ultimately, again, the director is the captain of the ship, and I think some directors, are very collaborative and want to work with writers and enjoy that process, and some directors don't. Some directors are brilliant writers themselves and are perfectly capable of writing things. So I mean, I like to joke that I've had every possible screenwriting here. Every possible screenwriting experience here in Hollywood, right the way through from bad to awful. And I'm joking, of course, because actually I've had some wonderful times. But there's a moment when Jared in the book kind of addresses this, and sometimes he finds it easier to explain things through the medium of algorithms because he's a robot. So at one point he figures out that the algorithm for producing a movie, the box at the top says, is everything with the movie going as well as it possibly can be? ? And then you have two routes from here. You have yes and no, and however you answer that question, whether it's yes or no, they both lead to a single box, which is, have you tried firing the writer? ? And then, there's another yes and no, and they both lead to fire the writer. So I mean, certainly that, that does still happen here in Los Angeles an awful lot. And, I think it's not uncommon for, I've had friends who've had this experience where, they've sold some script and, the studio, send it through 5 different writers, and then eventually at some point it comes back to them to undo all the rewriting that was done. So, as we were saying, the old maxim of nobody knows anything is probably still fully in force.
Did you have experience in writing for animation?
I did not, no. And that's a super interesting process because of course, it's freeing, and there's no in the movies, I think you have to be conscious of, you have to be somewhat conscious of budget, right? And so but when you're writing animation, it's kind of all the same budget because it costs the same to set something in outer space as it does in in someone's backyard.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other difference, of course, is with writing for animation, you also have, the input of all the storyboard artists, who are themselves, great storytellers, and that's their background. So, there's definitely more voices in the room, but, I found it great. And I think as, one of the great screenwriting rules is show, don't tell. But I think, as naturally as writers, I think we're probably slightly more word people than picture people.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that, having those storyboard artists is brilliant because they are just, they're such fantastic visual storytellers.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that was my first experience in the world of animation, but I really enjoyed it. I would definitely do it again.
So writing for animation, do you have voices in mind? Because, they add voice actors to the animation, or is
it... I mean, generally, I tend to, whenever I write anything, I try to not have actors in mind, because what I always find is that, if you do that, then you kind of end up with kind of the version of the person that the actor always plays. Like there's a British actor called Bill Nighy, and you know him from things like Love Actually, where he's the old rocker guy, and he's a brilliant actor. He's one of our leading actors, for many decades now. But I increasingly think that, I suspect that writers now at this point, when they're writing a script, they might not even make up a character name. They might just put in old Bill Nighy enters, because they just always have the poor guy doing kind of the same thing. So I think that I try and really consciously not have those thoughts in mind in terms of the animation process. I think that I know that, and again, it's not a secret that what they do at Pixar is they'll do what's called scratch recording. So when they're kind of the process for animation is that you tend to do sort of like a very rough looking animation first, so it's not colored, it's just kind of sketched out from the storyboard. It's almost in live action what they'd call a pre-visualization, and that's the medium that you work with to get the story right, and then with the dialogue for that, they do what's called scratch recording. So that will tend to be not people, not famous actors certainly, and rarely the people that are going to be the final voice on the movie, but it's just someone, so it's someone playing that part until you bring in whoever they bring in, for Tom Hanks or whoever for the main role.
Mm-hmm. So let's I'll get back to Set My Heart to 5. Did you overwrite it and have to cut out parts? Was there much you had to edit?
It's a great question. With this one, actually, no. I mean, I think everyone's process is different. I tend to edit fairly heavily as I go. Mm-hmm. So I think I certainly, I'm sure that in the process, just in terms of sheer numbers of words typed, it probably would be equivalent to, a massive editing job, but at the same time, it meant that when I got to the end of the manuscript, of course, I, had many more passes on it, but there wasn't ever this 20,000 word chunk is going, and partly also, I think, because it's in some ways a quest and a journey story. I think, sort of ahead of time, you can slightly know, what you're going to need to tell that story. So in some ways, I think maybe the biggest work was just on the voice, actually. So, as you've read, there's lots of jokes and one-liners along the way, and part of Jared's thing is, we're kind of supposed to find androids a little bit irritating. So trying to sort of convey that in a way that's, you're aware of it being irritating, but you find it funny rather than it just being irritating.
Yeah.
So that was probably the most work in terms of, I'd sit there in the coffee shop kind of, reading it out loud to myself under my breath and, getting lots of funny looks along the way.
Huh. No, and then other people are like, maybe I should be doing the same thing. And then everyone's doing it.
Absolutely, yeah. Maybe I've given them the evolutionary pressure this time.
So, considering the way the phrases or the paragraphs are laid out on the page, did you have to? I haven't noticed if there's any lyrical or poetic, what's the word I'm looking for, pattern to it. Was there anything like that as you were writing this that you had to be aware of or maintained?
I think the main thing is kind of that gradual transition from, Jared really speaking almost entirely in lines of code to like beginning to kind of, it to be more flowing. And then also kind of as his feelings develop, he begins to understand things like, metaphor and pun, although of course he tends to not necessarily get them right. Like he thinks puns are much funnier than they are. So, that's kind of a recurring motive. And then structurally, maybe the one sort of unusual thing that happens is some sections of the book are written in screenplay format, like they're laid out like a screenplay. And the idea for that is two things. There's one, of course, is, Jared's writing a screenplay, so lots of the book is about screenwriting, and it felt to me like if you're going to tell a story that screenwriting is such an important part of, it makes sense to kind of, have a bit of that and show the journey he's on that way. But then the other thing is that I kind of stumbled upon this in truth. I found it a very freeing thing because the book's written, apart from these sections, the book's written in the first person. So, of course, if you have a first person narrator, they can tell you how they're feeling at any point. But I think there's something sometimes, and that can be very powerful, but I think sometimes there's a different kind of power and perhaps a bigger power in simply just witnessing something ourselves as an audience. So perhaps some of the emotional parts to be written in screenplay format, so we take the camera kind of outside, directly in there and process it over here in the corner of the room and watch the scene unfold. Of course, those scenes are still written by Jared because it's Jared's book, so they're all still kind of seen through his prism. But it's a kind of a technique that I think let me feel a bit more for him.
Mm-hmm. Have you since you mentioned the coding part a couple of times, have you ever enjoyed the pain of actually coding?
I have not, and my full admiration to anybody that has and that can, because they make our world run, don't they? And it's funny, like I haven't. It's only been actually since the book came out that I've been thinking, well, maybe I should investigate that. And I've had a couple of preliminary conversations with friends who have been to boot camps and things like that. But in all honesty, I struggle making Squarespace work by website, so I don't know if I would last very long.
Oh man. So I'll ask a bit of a whimsical question now.
Sure.
When you were younger, was there any power technology or fictional setting that you yearned for or wanted to be part of?
Oh wow! What a great question. I think again, going to the. I think so much often just stems from the simple chronology of when you grew up, and so in that kind of late 80s, early 90s time, late 80s really actually. I think our whole generation's collective view of the future was just forever shaped by the Back to the Future movies. And so, I think that probably the hoverboard was the bit of technology, the skateboard that was, hovered was the bit of technology that we all just yearned for, like so much more than even flying cars. It was the hoverboard was the bit that we wanted. And unfortunately, that's, seems to be one of the few things from that movie that hasn't actually already happened.
So I grew up in the U.S., but off watching PBS and BBC and all the English shows and all that. And so I wonder, so what was it like growing up in Scotland as far as, it seems like that part of the world was the coolest place. All the coolest stuff was coming out of there. Did it feel that way to you?
No, and it's so funny, isn't it? I mean, like, absolutely the opposite. You know, I think, we would talk about, that we were all endlessly fascinated with American culture, and it was, all the, and I think the movies had such a big, a big part of that. And I think we underestimate as a world, like, the impact that, those representations have on, how we think and how we feel as a planet almost. Mm. So yeah, for us, it was, if it was American, it was probably cool, in a way that, like, my American friends here are often, they'll often have sort of, like, surprising knowledge of, things which I consider to be weird, minor, minor British things that I was aware of growing up. And, I guess just to give you one example, like, obviously British comedy is, huge, or in a certain subculture, British comedy has, for decades had a, beloved place here. But, when I first came to Los Angeles, one of the very first things I wanted to do was I heard that you could go and visit the place where the old comedy MASH was filmed. And so I took a hike out to the setting of MASH. And of course, maybe I think sometimes, like, perhaps, the way in which Monty Python was so, the way in which some of my American friends feel about Monty Python might be similar to the way I feel about MASH. And I think there's just maybe something that just, we're intrinsically programmed to value the thing that's different from where we are.
Mm-hmm. Benny Hill is one that I really enjoyed. Great.
Some good physical comedy there, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's funny, isn't it? Because, like, we sort of, I think, as screenwriters and, as anyone, humor, I think it evolves all the time. And I think, we spend so much time trying to do clever abstract wordplay or something. Mm-hmm. But, someone pulling a chair away and someone falling down is still the thing that, mm-hmm. we often find, that's the laugh out loud funny stuff.
Yeah. I know some of Benny Hill's humor wouldn't pass muster nowadays, but I was always amazed at how much he could write, how many, lyrical things he could write, like, just endlessly, all these word plays that he had.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder, I don't know the story. I wonder if he had a team. Like, I think in those days it wasn't uncommon for those people to have, like a whole team behind them. So I wonder, maybe we'll have to look it up, but I think it's possible that he may have had, a writer's room behind him.
That may be, but no one else seemed to have that kind of writer's room that he had, at least what we got.
Yeah.
So, did you have any difficulties finishing or getting the book published?
No, I mean, I had a little bit of a hiccup because my mum got sick right when I was finishing it, and so there was probably, I lost, probably a bit of time there. So the book sat on my hard drive for quite a long time. Mm. And then when we kind of took out in the world, like, obviously I work as a screenwriter, so I have, some connections in the world, but, not many in the world of publishing. I was lucky to find a great agent in London, and she sent it out. And I think, again, it's an unusual book. So, we definitely had interest very quickly, but equally, I think some people were interested, but were, a bit, wary of the fact it was a book about a screenwriting android. And so much of it, I think, in publishing comes down to marketing, right? I mean, I'm learning this more and more that, sometimes they might love something, but, if they don't know how to market it, then that's going to be a problem. And actually, maybe 30 years ago, things were, published simply on, an editor's approval or recommendation. And now it's much more a sort of cohesive thing of, like, how are we going to market this book and all of that. So we were lucky. The book found its home with, great publishers both in the US and the UK. And I think they've all absolutely got, what I was trying to do and have been very supportive of that. But yeah, I think, there's probably, as with anything, there's, just so much content now and so many submissions that, it's probably, I think for all of us who are kind of, because I'm sort of starting out in this, it's my first novel. I think, it always takes a bit of luck to find the right people that are going to support you, and I was lucky to find them.
Mm-hmm. I've actually known a couple writers who got good contracts, but their complaint was that as first-time writers, they had to do their own marketing, that the publisher didn't do a whole lot for them. They kind of threw them out into the wild and said, get yourself popular.
Yeah. And I think at a very elementary level, I think that's kind of the basic model. I've had this explained to me that because, so many books get published. So, for instance, in Britain last week, there were 600 new hardback books published. Mm-hmm. And that's partly books that were delayed from the spring because of the pandemic, and partly it's because, September is when they publish, lots of the big books for the run-up to the holidays. Mm-hmm. But, the idea of how anyone can expect to be, heard or found, if you don't already have some sort of following, it's a, incredible challenge. And I think, as it's been explained to me, is, publishing a book is expensive for the publishers, but it's not like making a movie is for the studios. It's not hundreds of millions of dollars. So, the idea is that, you kind of spread your bet, right? So you publish, several books, and then you wait and see which one is the one that's kind of gathering steam, and that's the one that you then put the weight of your limited marketing and advertising budget behind. So yeah, I think your friend's probably, are probably absolutely right that is the experience. And I guess one thing that I've done is I've been kind of drag kicking and screaming onto Twitter. Yeah. And I've actually been enjoying it. Like it's been nice to interact with people, and but it's quite addictive, and I don't know how brilliant it is for mental health, because of course, I subscribe to lots of book things, and you can easily spend your day reading, lists of best books, which are all other people's books and not your book. So I think it's a double-edged sword, but just in this climate, right? There's just there's so much content, and it's wonderful because it means that we all have a lot to choose from. We all have a lot of ways to spend our time, our leisure time. But it's definitely, I think, ever harder to get your voice heard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of all the social media platforms, I get the impression from my limited bit of experiences that a writer would do best by having a good Twitter account. That one gives the most exposure.
Great, yeah. That sounds right to me, and I think theoretically it's the one that should play to a natural strength because it's words, right? Mm-hmm. And equally, I've heard that Instagram is actually the one that's most challenging for for mental health. Like that's been shown that because I think the thing about Twitter and Facebook is that people will fairly frequently post on those things, that they're having a bad day, or their job just fell through, or something else. Whereas Instagram is, of course, image based, and it's mainly just people's happiest moments and achievements. And I think if we were from another planet and we wanted to design a system for humans to feel not good enough and inadequate and unhappy, we might design a stream of everyone you celebrating their greatest moments whilst you're sitting at home on your couch scrolling through them. That might be what that system would look like, I think.
Yeah. So what's your next or current writing project?
Great. Yeah. Well, so currently I'm actually writing the screenplay for this book. So we had some great excitement in that. The director, Edgar Wright, liked the book, and so I've been writing the screenplay for him with the hope that it will be a movie by him someday.
So what do you think of the source material you're working from?
It's promising but flawed. It's actually quite funny because I've actually found it. I think when I've adapted things in the past, when I've adapted other books for a studio or production company or something, I think I'm always so respectful of the writer, and I'm trying to square the circle of get to the bottom of the writer's vision and, staying true to the text whilst also, inevitably there's, things you have to change to make it fit on the screen. Mm. And I've always been sort of, so cautious about that. Whereas, the fact that it's my own book, I think I feel much freer to say, oh, we can change that. That's fine. That doesn't matter. Let's just make the best possible screen version of this. And I think also there's been this brilliant letting go thing that the book was my version of the story. I've told that story and I've had my chance to tell that story, and I'm thrilled that it's out there and people are reading it. And then in this case, I think Edgar is such an amazing storyteller and such an amazing director that, I'm as thrilled as anyone to see, his version of it. And I just want to, do whatever I can to support that.
Mm-hmm. Can you say if it's going to be animated or live action?
Yeah, it's live action. I can definitely say that. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. But you haven't decided what actors you want or actresses you want in the various roles, right?
Yeah, no, that's well above my pay grade, unfortunately. Or actually, fortunately, I think Edgar's movies are just always so brilliant in every capacity, and they're also, always exquisitely cast. So yeah, I haven't had a conversation with him about it at all, but I'll be very excited to hear who he has in mind.
Yeah. So where can people find you online?
Great. So I am. I'm a few places. We just mentioned Twitter, and my address at Twitter is the Simon Bot, which, with hindsight, I think probably not a great idea to have bot in your Twitter name. I thought it'd be funny, and but I'm pretty sure I'm regularly banned from things, and that I'm not showing up in people's feeds because it contains the word bot. So if you can find me at the Simon Bot, and then my website is you can get it two ways. You can either do simonstevensonph.com, or you can just go to setmyheart5.com, but they both go to the same place because that bit on Squarespace I was able to work. That was one of the simpler things.
Now, you can change your Twitter name. Is there a reason? I guess my question is, if you are worried about that, would you change your name, or are you just you're married to what you have?
I would change it. I think the truth is that I don't quite know. I have sort of, I'm new to it, so I have about 500 followers right now, and I don't know, if I'm just, not getting much interaction. I get some interaction, but I don't know if I'm not getting so much interaction simply because I have, only 500 followers, or if it's to do with the bot thing. So I think I'll give it a little while and see what happens. But you're absolutely right that I'd forgotten that you can just change that, can't you? So yeah. So yeah, I can change it. The Simon is not a bot. I wonder if that would help.
That's a funny one. And I don't think you'd lose any. It doesn't. Your followers don't disengage just because they see a different name. They might, but they'll still be linked to you, I guess. Yeah,
it's like phone numbers, isn't it? It's like no one's actually typing out my Twitter name at the moment, just as we don't remember phone numbers anymore. It doesn't really matter, right? It's just, you click on my grinning face on your Twitter, and that's how it is.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, that's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts or words?
No, I just want to say thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed chatting today. Brilliant.
Yeah, me too. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you for listening. If you like this podcast, Full Contact Nerd, please subscribe and rate it if you can. If you want more fiction and fiction studies ranging from ancient mythology to modern day sci-fi, fantasy, and horror, please sign up for my weekly newsletter at fullcontactnerd.com or crisalvarez.com to keep up with my latest posts. On my webpage, you'll also find written interviews and links to my social media accounts on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. I also discuss art, acting, comic books, gaming, and much more. Thanks again, and keep imagining the past, the present, and the future.